Hi everyone, Ken Woods here, conductor of the English Symphony Orchestra, and I'm very excited to welcome my dear friend Wanda Sobieska from almost halfway around the world in Cleveland, Ohio. Wanda has contributed the magnificent illustrations for The Ugly Duckling. Wanda, it's great to see you. How are you?
Good, good. How are you? It's great to
Yeah,
see you.
I'm doing well. Now, you and I came to know each other not through your capacity as an artist, but as a violinist. And I think it's worth people knowing that you're a violinist, you're a composer, poet, and illustrator. And the first thing I wanted to ask you was whether you could have or would have done this project in the same way had you not been a musician as well as an artist.
No, I think it would have, been completely different kind of a process. I don't know, being a musician for me, the music comes first and foremost. And essentially during the process, the illustrations were always a response to the music, most of all. So.
Tell me about your beginnings as a visual artist. When did you start drawing, and was it something that you were passionate about when you were young? Was it did it develop in parallel with your musical abilities?
I don't know. I don't really remember a time that I wasn't drawing. It was just, I remember one of my earliest memories, was I was like in a little baby crib in Warsaw in, communist Poland. And there was a little sticker with an angel on the crib. And I could barely stand up, but I was looking at the sticker like, oh, that's well drawn. Okay, that was well done. So I had my opinions already. Um, so it was just something I've been doing my whole life. I guess, when the time came to decide what I would study in college, I seriously thought about art, but it seemed like with music there was a certain um, capacity for improvement that I had to do in right away in that time, and the visual arts had a little more of a flexible component to them, so that's why
Of course. Now,
combining some
for listeners who don't know you, you are actually from a family of musicians, aren't you?
yeah, yeah, fifth generation.
Fifth generation.
Genetic disorder with us, yeah. My
There
father,
was no escape.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah, well, I was doomed to a musician's life, I guess. Um,
let's come back a little bit to the development of your drawings.
yeah,
As I said at the beginning, is I didn't know that you really had this particular bow in your quiver until I'd known you quite a while, and it might have been Monster Forest that first tipped me off, which is this lovely little story that's really aimed at
that's
much
true.
younger kids. Um, and my children were completely besotted with it when they were, sort of two,
Yeah,
three, 4 years old. And I think they could probably both still recite it from memory. But it does strike me that the visual language of Monster Forest and Ugly Duckling has some commonalities to it. And I'm wondering, if you could maybe share a little bit of what influences maybe shaped your visual language as an artist, and whether that goes into areas other than illustrations of stories.
well, one thing that comes to mind immediately, I don't know, this is just a small little observation, but at the end of Monster Forest, there's a picture of an owl in a tree, and the tree kind of has this gaping face to it. And also in Ugly Duckling, I wound up at the end having trees that are kind of humanoid in a sense. I don't know why that is. Well, maybe because I'm inspired by nature. So that would be an inspiration there. As far
So
as
in a
visual
sense, it's
language,
more shaped by your experience as a person than by influences of particular artists or other works.
one artist that has a special place in my heart is Jan Marcin Szancer,
Mhm.
who was a Polish artist born in 1920, I believe. and he did tremendous work as an illustrator, especially in children's books. So it was some of the earliest stuff that I remember, going back to those early days in the crib. But he did illustrations for children, but they were literally the most magnificent works of art, and are still, of course.
Mm. We'll assure our viewers who are watching this that we'll put some links to his work below the video, so they can follow that down the rabbit hole and explore, because it's a name that's new to me as well. I'm excited to go hunting. Talk a little bit about the medium in which you worked for the Ugly Duckling. It's an unusual one. It's not oil painting. It's something else, and I think it'll be interesting to young artists in particular.
Yeah. Well, so they were all hand-drawn illustrations, and I find there's a special quality, it has a personal touch to it. But specifically what I used, and I brought the visual aid, I used art markers.
Hey.
So these are the two I wrote about in the blog, shale and slate. You can just cover any territory with this. But I guess on a technical note, the way I went about it is I made little frames on pieces of paper, outlines, and then I had a storyboard from which I was working, and then I would pencil in character drawings or backgrounds or what have you, and then outline with some sort of thin outline pen or marker, and then color it in. And then as far as computer software, I just used it to superimpose character drawings over backgrounds, and occasionally put in a solid fill of color. That was about it.
That's interesting. So everything was sort of scanned, but drawn on paper, scanned in, and then very occasionally images mixed and matched with each other a little bit.
Yeah. So I have the
One
box
thing
of
I
paper
find
somewhere in my storage.
well, first of all, I mean, I want to say to young people watching this ought to be uplifting. I know, for my kids, so many hours spent in their use drawing with markers, and you get the sense, sometimes well, if you're going to get serious about art, you've got to get a brush and some paint and a piece of canvas. But it just goes to show in a way that art is the vision of the artist as much as it is the medium. What you've done with these markers is just incredible. One thing that we've tried to do with the new video of Duckling is to just use the evolving technology of how to assemble images in time to do more elaborate fades between images and create some sense of motion across some of the things that you've done. But as we were working on that in post-production, it occurred to me that some of your images, I swear to goodness, I'd look at them and it seems like the image is moving somehow. And I'm just curious if that was something that you consciously developed, that, in the course of a musical moment where the music is going in a direction, that you were conscious of trying to create a sense of a flow through time in the image itself.
Oh, that's an interesting observation. Well, it's not something that I consciously did. I think, as I wrote, at the heart of this project for me was the question of how well I could listen rather than what I could create. So I listened to your score so many times that I think on a subconscious level, things just kind of evolved. Actually, my mother had an interesting observation at one point, that a lot of the pictures, there aren't very many horizontal lines like that. A lot of like slanted, going up, going down. And also, I was playing with perspective. As a simple example, in the beginning, you see the mother duck and it goes in from the top.
Mm-hmm.
And then at the very end, you're looking upwards as the swans fade out. Kind of play in that direction. So I suppose if we're playing with different perspectives on space, we might as well play with perspectives on time, and it all ties together.
It's interesting, I'm sitting in front of a favorite painting of mine by Philip Groom, and we tend to think of visual arts as single things, the Mona Lisa or whatever, you know, that they're individual images that kind of stand on their own and you can look at them and say, oh, that's nice. But a project like this, where you are telling a story through images, uh, starts to introduce other aspects of creativity. And one thing that I love about your images, and which you speak to a little bit in the essay that's on our website, is thinking structurally about how they hang together, and this idea that you're starting with the camera above and then finishing with the camera looking up in a way. Or this, you know, the camera is your drawing. Um,
Mhm.
you know, there's all sorts of points in which I think you've basically created a musical structure in images that mirrors the one that I put in the music.
Yeah, I think so. And well, I think part of that has to do with the fact that my family runs that opera company. So I'm used to dealing with structure and drama. And also, another thing I have experience with is running super titles. And that has a sort of aspect of the pacing in relation to the music and what is going on stage. So that timing element is something I've had the opportunity to fine tune over the years.
Well, I mean, it's very interesting in a way to think that, you know, one can start with a literal blank slate and then start to think not just of what the images are going to be, but when they're going to appear and how. You know, what are the psychological beats of the story that cause the images to appear? And you know, in that sense, I mean, there is a fine art in opera staging too, of trying to think, you know, do I move first and then sing, or do I sing first and then move? You know, what's the process that the character is going through that causes the various actions to take place on stage?
Yeah, I mean, going back to your first question, if I hadn't been a musician, what would have happened? It's also a question of putting the concept of tempo into visual art.
Hmm. And do we see that in the, well, how do we see that in the resulting illustrations? Do they change more frequently when the music is fast, or is there a greater density of information at certain points within the images themselves?
I guess the flow just naturally responds to the music. For instance, in the scene with the barnyard with all the characters, at one point the duckling is getting attacked by the different critters, and so the images change more rapidly. And when it's a more reflective, thought-provoking mood, like when he's alone on the lake, the the evolution is slower.
Of course, part of the audience that we want to make sure this project reaches is young people. And do you have experiences of animation as a young person when you were growing up that you feel shaped your approach to a project like this? And are there things that you might direct young viewers towards, whether it's specific animators or just ways of watching animation that might help them learn and develop their skills?
Well, one of the um, one thing that I loved as a kid growing up was those old Disney movies, and I would watch them a lot. So I suppose there's an influence there. But I don't know if I dabbled much in animation.
Mhm.
Um, that was kind of a dream for me, but I always loved the hand drawn stuff, and now that so much of it is computer generated, it seems to have gone in a different direction, which is okay. But I suppose for young people, I would suggest just to listen or to watch as much as possible and to observe, um, and just have an open mind. If something catches your interest, just observe it for a while before you start having opinions on it.
I think that's a really powerful thing. When you said in your essay that your first step in the Ugly Duckling project was to listen to my piece, you know, 60, 70, 80, 100 times, my first thought was sort of embarrassment. I was like, oh God, what have I done to Wanda? This is terrible. But of course, as a creative person, you,
Wonderful.
you, you do want it to be heard, and you want, the essence of a successful piece, I think, is that it it rewards repeated engagement, and I think it's one of the hardest things for young people to learn is that you can watch a movie or listen to a piece of music or read a story, and maybe you enjoy it, maybe you don't enjoy it, but you will have only just experienced the tiniest little surface level of what it is. Um, and sometimes, the best thing you can do is, whether your reaction is positive or negative, set it to one side and just keep engaging with it, and keep coming back to it, and let it work its way into your soul for a while, and then respond to it from a place of really deep familiarity.
Yeah, yeah. And I suppose that every time we experience a work of art, we will discover something new. And another thing I wrote about in the letter was the progression of time. And it seems to me like, if we experience a work of art and then come back to it some years later, it's a new experience because we are different as a person. So we have changed.
It's That's absolutely true, and I mean there are certainly things that were big blind spots for me when I was young that I've come to really, really love. I mean, I think there was a stage in my
Yeah.
life where if it wasn't fiery and dramatic and bordering on tragic, I didn't want anything to do with it. And things like, Haydn, I mean, what's the point, But of course, now that's become something that I really, really love, and I've learned to understand the power of understatement in art. I think that for me took a lot of maturing and growing up and coming back to things. Uh, and I,
Here's a thought about art in general I just had a few days ago. I was thinking, well, when we perform a piece of music, how do we present it? How do we shape it? And I thought, gee, how much does the music shape us rather than us shaping it?
mhm. Well, it's constantly rewiring us, I think, and it does shape us. And I think one of the perks of being a musician is that it forces you into a lifetime of sort of self-assessment and growth, and
Yeah,
uh, that you never stop learning. Um,
there's
and
always room for improvement.
to a certain extent, it's also one of the things that I think is unfortunate about certain aspects of our musical life, where the economics of making the field viable means that musicians are forced to play the same 25 pieces over and over and over and over again, which kind of goes against what I was just saying about living with things over time. But, you know, sometimes you need to put things away and come back to them fresh. And if you're doing Tchaikovsky 5 every single year, at some point you need a break from it before you can really experience it with the sense of awe and discovery that it ought to. In fact, I did the last time I did Tchaik 5 was with a youth orchestra, and not a single kid in the group had played the piece before. And it was a residential course, so after the first day's rehearsal, we all retreated to the dormitories, and there was a little sort of common room where everyone was playing, and I walked through there on my way to my apartment at the end of the day, and I could hear all these teenagers singing Tchaik 5 at the top of their lungs, obviously just in love with the piece and discovering it. You think, this is such an amazing thing. And thing, and as musicians we should never let go of it. There ought to be another piece out there that we can go and find and fall in love with, and that we should always be able to come back to the Tchaik 5s and remember what it was like to discover them for the first time. Just
Wonderful
for
to hear.
our viewers, tell us a little bit more about the breadth of what you do and what you're doing these days. You work in the family opera company. You're a poet. You're a composer. You play the violin. Uh, what are some of the things you've been working on of late, and how did those all sort of knit together in your creative life?
Um, huh. Well, actually, recently I've been writing a little bit of music, so we'll see what happens with it. But one of the things that interests me a lot is American Indian cultures, the native
Mm.
cultures here. And there was a passage that I kept reading over and over again some years ago. Um, and about a year ago, I wrote a piece for string quartet with narrator. And that was a setting of that text. And then this summer, I wrote a piece. Man, this was funny. This is a little orchestra piece, but kind of the fundamental little components of it, thematic material had been in my mind for like 12 or 13 years.
Wow.
And I just couldn't get it out of my system. I kind of gave up on it at one point. I was like, well, I guess it's not going to get written. Oh, well, too bad. But I don't know, sometime in March or April, I figure out a different way of looking at it. Actually tied more into the classical tradition of Haydn. And I finally gave birth to this thing. So
It's such a relief, isn't it, when you finally
yeah.
find a way to get it onto the page. I mean, well, to come back to Ugly Duckling for the moment, I mean, that was a difficult birth. You know, I worked so hard on it, and you know, it's often with a piece, there are passages that you can sort of sit down and write, and then there are others that you're staring at a blank page for weeks, watching the deadline approach like a Mack truck, and then the deadline passes and you ask for an extension and you're still struggling. And certainly, I don't think it's obvious necessarily to the listener what, you know, which process led to which bit of a piece. I mean, you look at a piece like Sibelius's Fifth Symphony, which he revised extensively more than once. You know, you would never listen to the final version of the piece and think, gosh, you know, he really had to struggle with this. Instead, it feels sort of like it was all destined to be from the inspiration of the opening note. How else could it unfold? But it took him quite a lot of searching. And I was talking to my friend Matthew Taylor the other day about his Fifth Symphony, which everyone who encounters it absolutely loves. And he says that, you know, it was the one that gave him the most trouble. It just, you know, he said, you know, his family was noting lots and lots of profanity coming out of his office while he was composing it. But it doesn't sound that way at all, you know. So it's funny how the process and the product can often be very different from each other.
Yeah. There's, I guess, no rule for these things.
Yeah.
Yeah, I posted. I have my website, freegigmusic.com. I posted some little solo pieces that I wrote for any instrument. They're there right now, and I drew a picture to accompany it. So.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for talking with us. Links to Wanda's website will also be in the video below. So follow those. Check out her work on freegigmusic.com. Check out Monster Forest, which is great fun, especially for the young ones. And we hope you enjoy The Ugly Duckling.